Great. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's FINTRAC training. I will be leading today's discussion. We're basically going to go over the FINTRAC forms that you would have to fill out whenever you're doing a purchase or sale transaction. I will walk you through which sections you need to fill out, what you need to know. And if you have any questions, we'll leave some time for sure at the end of the session for your questions to be answered. So I'm going to start off by going to the agent portal. Everyone should have their login already. So when you go into the portal under Office Resources, if you go to training resources and videos, this is where we post a lot of our training materials on Broker Bay, prospecting, property showings, TREP training videos. And at the very top, we've uploaded FINTRAC sample forms. So these are the 3 documents I'm going to be talking about today. So you can download these. There's kind of annotations in the PDF files for you to read through. But I think once you fill out a couple of these, you'll be experts in no time. And they're not actually that complicated to fill out. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you can all see this. So maybe before we start going to the forms, I will just go over what is FINTRAC, why do we have this? We have enough forms to make our lives difficult for every transaction. Why do we have to fill this other form? So FINTRAC is the Financial Transactions and Reporting Analysis Center of Canada. That's what it stands for. And FINTRAC basically is the government agency that oversees the implementation of Canada's money laundering, anti-money laundering, and proceeds of crime statute. So that's a federal piece of legislation. FINTRAC is the agency that enforces this law. And as real estate brokers and salespersons, we have an obligation to maintain these records of our clients. And in the event our brokerage is ever audited by FINTRAC, we would have to provide these records to FINTRAC. And that's why whenever you submit a transaction, if you don't have the FINTRAC forms completed, your deal probably will not be closed. And so it's very important to get these done, at the very beginning of your transaction, so you can check it off the box, not think about it again. And it just makes everyone's lives much easier if you get this info from the beginning. So when do you need to do the FINTRAC forms? So whenever you're acting as an agent for a client who's looking to buy or sell real estate, you have to fill out the FINTRAC forms. So there's the individual ID record. There is the corporation ID record, if your client is a corporation. And there's also the receipt of funds record, if you're receiving money. So one thing to note here is I mentioned specifically if you're buying or selling real estate. So what about when you're doing leases? So if you're representing a client who is looking to rent or who is looking to rent out their property, you don't need to do FINTRAC. And so it's only for buying and selling real estate. And you can see here, you must complete this for your represented and unrepresented buyer or seller. So even if you don't have a BRA or a listing agreement, if you are just, for whatever reason, if you don't have an agreement, agency agreement with your client, you still need to do the FINTRAC form. So the other part of this is if you're doing pre-construction projects, you may encounter from time to time, builders will ask you to complete a mandatory agreement. And what that means is basically the builder is relying on you to verify the individual client's identity. The builder is relying on you to fill out this form because under FINTRAC legislation, technically it's the builder's responsibility to verify ID for individuals. But because you are the, the co-op agent for this pre-con project, you will have that obligation. So that's why if you have a deal with a builder for a new home, new project, they will ask you to sign this mandatory agreement, which is not the same as mandatory. Mandatory means you are acting as a mandatory or agent on behalf of the builder. So you take on that, verification and record keeping obligation, but really it's no different from any purchase or sale transaction. So I think next we can move on to the kind of the individual forms. So the first form, the individual ID form is probably the form you're going to be using the most together with the receipt of funds record. So I would say whenever you're doing any kind of listing agreement or, offer for your buyer, you definitely need to fill this out. And we include this forms, all of these forms in our transaction packages on the agent portal. So if you're doing a listing agreement for a residential property, or putting an offer on a property, you need to fill out the form. So you see here is very clear for a buyer when the offer is submitted or a deposit is made, or for a seller when the seller accepts the offer. So you need to put in here the transaction property address, your name as the sales representative / broker, and then the date that you verified the information. So usually, you will ask your client for their valid government issued ID. And when on the date that they give that information to you, that is the date you're going to verify their ID and complete this form. So there's a few sections in this form. The first section is verification. So you need to complete either section A1, A2, or A3. Most transactions, you will be completing A1 because you're going to ask your client for a valid federal, provincial, or territorial government issued ID. So that means a driver's license, a passport, permanent resident card. I think those are all valid. So you need to fill in first the full legal name of the individual, their address of their residence, their date of birth, and their principal business or occupation. So on this point, it's not enough to just put, my client as a, retail worker or salesperson or, caretaker. You have to put the specific occupation, their job title, and the name of the employer. So here, car salesman at Mercedes-Benz of Richmond Hill. You have to be specific with your client's occupation, employer, and title. So I think a lot of people, maybe they put like very general terms of what their client does, but you have to put more details. So their role, their title, and their employer. So I mentioned the A1 section. That's going to be what most of us will fill out. A2 and A3 are only if you cannot complete the previous section. So, most clients should have a government ID. Even if you don't have a driver's license, you can get a photo ID from the government of Ontario. And, so in section 1 or part 1 here, you're going to put driver's license. Part 2, you're going to put the number on the driver's license. Issuing jurisdiction is going to be Ontario if it's a driver's license, or Canada if it's a passport. And then you'll put the document expiry date here. If your client does not have a valid government issue ID, then you would do section A2. A2 basically means you need to verify their credit history, credit file. So that means pulling a full credit report on your clients, verifying their name, date of birth, and address information, making sure those are all in the credit report and that they've been in existence for at least 3 years. So if you have a client who is maybe a newcomer to Canada, and I think for any client, the best verification method is the first one. So getting a valid government issued photo ID. Even if, all they have is a passport from another country, you can put that here, right? Because it's a government issue ID. They let you put the country name in here. So, if they're a newcomer, they probably have a passport. So you should be putting the passport info here. If not, then you can fill out A2. And if you can't fill out A2, then the only section you can fill out is kind of A3. So A3 is kind of dual ID method. I won't go into it too much. You can talk to any of the managers to talk in more details about this, but it's an additional step. You need 2 IDs at least to verify the individual's identity. A bit more complicated. I think, the easiest way is to get the valid government issued ID, fill this info in, and then you will move on to section B. So section B is verification of third parties, and you're only complete the section when there's a third party that's involved in the transaction. So you see in the notes here, if there's a power of attorney or someone else who provided the deposit for the buyer, then you need to get their ID, right? Because part of FINTRAC is to trace where are the funds coming from. And if your buyer client, if their deposit is being paid by someone else, you definitely need to get that person's ID and verify their information. Because we obviously can't have random, funds coming from who knows where. So, the easiest rule to remember is whoever you're representing for in the transaction, if it's 1 buyer, 2 buyers, 1 seller, 2 sellers, you need ID for everyone. And that actually reminds me of a good point. If you have more than 1 client, can I just get 1 ID record for 1 individual? Or can I just verify 1 person's ID? The answer is no. You need to verify everyone that you represent as a client, even if they're your customer. Even if you do not have a signed representation agreement, you need to verify their ID. So best practice is to have a separate individual ID record for each individual. So I think some people used to combine multiple clients into 1 form. That is not okay for FINTRAC. You need to have a separate form for each person. So as I mentioned, section B, you will only complete if you're representing a third party. If you're not, you can skip to section C. This is where you assess your client's risk. And I think it's important to note here, this is a required section. It doesn't mean you complete section A and you move on. You have to complete section C as well. So section C is where you determine the level of risk of a money laundering or terrorist financing offense for this client. And I would say most clients will probably fall into low risk. If you have a client who is in medium or high risk, or if you're unsure, talk to our managers and we will help you with the form. But low risk basically means a Canadian citizen or resident who is either physically in Canada, or if they're not physically in Canada, that is still okay, considered to be low risk. If they are a citizen or resident in a high crime area and there's no other high risk factors evident, then they're still considered low risk. And what is a high crime area? You can check on FINTRAC's website. They issue guidances on what those terms mean, because they do change, over time. And the other category is foreign citizen or resident who does not operate in a high risk country. whether they're physically present or not. So what is a high-risk country? So again, you need to check FINTRAC's website. They have a current list of high-risk countries. I think last check, it included North Korea, Iran, and some of the African countries. So if you have clients, especially if they're newcomers to Canada, you have to be aware of where they're coming from, why they're buying real estate. These are all good questions you want to ask, because end of the day, you want to protect yourself from any breach of FINTRAC, and you want to make sure you fill out these forms correctly. So again, if they're a foreign citizen or resident who does not operate in a high-risk country, then they're considered to be low risk. If they do operate in a high-risk country, then they are considered high risk. And it doesn't mean that you automatically cannot do the transaction, right? This is just a record-keeping obligation. But if your client is high risk, you need to put information here and talk to our managers, because there are additional record keeping and monitoring obligations if your client has a risk that's considered to be high. Section D is the last section in the individual ID form. Really, you will fill this out only if you have dealt with this client more than once in the past 5 years, because that's considered to be a business relationship. So, if it's the first time you've acted for this client in the past 5 years, you probably can skip this section. But, if you bought more than one property for them, you do need to fill this out. And, it's pretty straightforward. Again, D1 is just what are you acting for your client on, is it residential or commercial property? And D2 really is just what have you been doing to monitor this relationship and keep the client information up to date. So, do you email them? Do you speak to them over the phone regularly? What kind of records are you keeping? What kind of information are you including in your file? And, that's really it for the individual ID record. I know we're scheduled for half an hour, but I want to cover this, give you all the basic information you need and leave some time for questions. So the individual ID form, that's form 630. We have it on our agent portal and in your web form transaction templates. The corporate ID record is form 631. And it's very similar to the individual ID record, with the exception that obviously with a corporation, there are directors and officers. So whoever is signing the offer or the listing agreement, that individual, you need to complete the ID record for. So in A1, you basically put the corporation info first. So name, corporate address, principal business, and name of the directors. So for each director, you then have to complete the individual ID record. And then for the verification record for that corporation, usually it will be, a certificate of existence for the corporation, their articles and bylaws. You need their registration number. If they're Ontario corporation or a federal corporation, you can get all this information from your client. And then you also need to attach a copy of the corporate records showing who has the authority to bind the corporation. So, in commercial, maybe more commercial transaction, you'll see, a person is signing on behalf of the corporation. They need to have authority to bind the corporation. Otherwise, without authority, that signature is invalid. Your deal, your agreement is null and void. So you have to make sure you fill this out and attach a copy showing that this person has the authority to bind the corporation. So that may be, the articles showing who the directors are, or the share register showing who owns, shares of the company, if those are the people who are signing. Other entity, if they're not a corporation, if they're a partnership or, a sole proprietorship, those are some examples. You still need to verify their ID. Third parties, similar to what we talked about in the individual form, if there's a third party corporation or entity, you need to verify their ID as well. And again, Section C is where you assess the client risk. So if they are a Canadian corporation or entity, you check this off and you're done. If they are a foreign corporation or entity that does not operate in a high-risk country, then they are still considered low risk. And if they are in a high-risk country, obviously that's high risk. And again, you need to talk to our managers and see what other obligations there are to keep the FINTRAC records. And for corporate ID record, you need to fill out this section as well. So what's the purpose and nature of the business relationship, and what measures you are taking to monitor that business relationship. So the third form is the receipt of funds record. So you'll basically fill out this form whenever you receive funds for a transaction. So I think most transactions will involve, if you're acting for a buyer and you receive the deposit funds, then you have to fill out this form. So you'll put in the transaction property address, your name, and the date you received the funds. And then you need to fill in some information about the actual funds. So how much was received, the currency, the date of receipt, the type of funds. So was it a check, certified check, cash, bank draft, e-transfer, wire transfer, or other, and how you received it, in person, electronically, by mail, or other. And purpose, usually it will be for a deposit for a purpose, for purchase. And, importantly here, there is an option for cash, but I would strongly recommend you always receive non-cash funds, because if you're dealing with cash funds greater than $10,000, that's considered a large cash transaction for purpose of FINTRAC. And there's additional record keeping obligations that you have to meet if you are receiving large cash funds. So I'm not going to cover those today, but just something to know. I think most agents are dealing with bank drafts or certified checks or even e-transfer. You just have to fill out this form. If you're doing with a very large amount of cash, you definitely need to fill out this form and some other forms. And again, talk to our managers, get clarity and guidance before you do anything. If you talk to us after you've done something, it may be too late, but we can always help you. And then part D, after you've put in the information of the funds, here's where you have to put the name that the account, the name of the account holder, and also the account number and the type of account. So checking, savings, or trust. Obviously, some clients, they may ask you, why do I have to give you my account number? Well, your simple response is, this is for FINTRAC. I'm obligated to keep these records, and these records are all confidential. They're not shared with anyone. It's only for FINTRAC purposes. So that's kind of how you can explain, why this information is needed. And part of it is, if FINTRAC ever does audit, this transaction, they have to be able to trace where the funds came from, which account, and who was the account holder. Does that account holder match the name of the individual on the transaction? If it doesn't, then hopefully you completed the third party section, right? So here, you can see D2 must be completed for any time you've received funds. I think a lot of agents, they may have forgotten about D2, they fill out the other sections, but you really do have to fill this out. So the number of the account, where the funds came from, the name of the account holder, and if the funds came from someone who's not the buyer, you have to fill out their information as a third party on the form 630. So for example, if your client is, let's say that the client is a son or daughter, right? And the parents are paying for the deposit. So that's a great example where your buyer client is the person on the individual ID form, but you also need to fill out the third party section, which is on the second page of that form. So this is kind of a quick summary of FINTRAC, individual corporation ID record, and the receipt of funds record. I think I see a couple of questions. So Tina asked, what kind of valid ID? Yeah, driver's license is sufficient, or passport. Those are all valid government issued ID. Is a credit card okay? No, credit card has no photo. It's not valid government issued ID. So again, most people should have a driver's license or passport. If you're ever unsure, ask our managers first before you proceed. Catherine asked, how do you fill in the currency of the funds? So, usually you should be dealing with Canadian funds. So you just put CAD for Canadian dollars, or you can put in full words Canadian dollars, or another currency. So Grace asked, do I have to fill out this form if the buyer EMTs deposit directly to the listing brokerage? The answer is yes, because even though your buyer is directly wiring the funds to the listing brokerage, you should still fill out this form, because the option here provides for e-transfers and wire transfers. And your buyer is paying funds for this purchase. Obviously, you are not receiving the funds directly yourself, but you're still considered to be in receipt of those funds for the purpose of that transaction. So you do need to fill out the form, even if there's a e-transfer or wire transfer. But again, this is not for leases, because we know leases are not covered by the FINTRAC. Does not apply to leases, only for real estate purchase and sales. Yeah, good reminder from I think that's probably Yang. Ontario Health Card is not valid photo ID because it does not show your address. So you do need to get a driver's license. If you don't have one, seek some guidance from our managers. And Henry asked, do we need to attach copies of IDs? I don't think you need to attach it to the form, but you should definitely have a record of the ID, because if our deals department ever asks, or if FINTRAC ever audits us and you don't have a copy of the ID, then the question is, what did you verify? So the answer is yes, you should keep a copy of the ID. You can send it to us, to the deals department, but definitely have a record in your file. So I think we're 5 minutes over. Does anyone have any questions on what we covered today? Okay, if there's no questions, thank you for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, we will have these kinds of FINTRAC trainings every month at the beginning of the month. And FINTRAC is always, evolving. There's new regulations regularly, so we will incorporate those into our training sessions and let everyone know. So I hope everyone has a good day, and see you next time.